Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us at this press conference with the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. As you may know, the commission was created by the Human Rights Council in March of 2022 to investigate human rights violations in the context of the aggression against Ukraine by the Russian Federation. They presented their latest report to the General Assembly on Tuesday, and we're pleased to have with us today all three members of the commission who wanted to take this opportunity to meet with you and take your questions. In the middle, we have the chair of the commission, Mr. Erik Mose. To his right is Mr. Pablo de Greiff, and on the far left is Ms. Vrinda Gover. Now, the chair will begin with some opening remarks, followed by fellow commissioners, and then we'll take your questions. Thank you.
Good morning. We are here to share with you the main findings of our report that we presented before the third committee of the General Assembly Tuesday this week. Our most important conclusion is that Russian authorities have committed torture as a crime against humanity. During our two previous mandates, we reported on the widespread and systematic use of torture as a war crime by Russian authorities, both in Ukraine and in the Russian Federation. The victims were civilians and prisoners of war, both women and men. Our recent findings demonstrate that Russian authorities have committed torture in all provinces of Ukraine that came under their control, as well as in the detention facilities that the Commission has investigated in the Russian Federation. A map illustrating this region is posted on our website. The new evidence reinforces the previous conclusion that torture was widespread. The Commission also previously concluded that the use of torture was systematic. We identified common elements concerning the categories of person targeted, the aims for which torture was used, and the similarity of methods employed. This report contains evidence of further common elements, including, first, the transposition of violent practices common in Russian Federation detention facilities to similar facilities in occupied areas of Ukraine. Second, the recurrent use of sexual violence. Third, the deployment of specific services and security forces from the Russian Federation to the occupied areas they controlled in Ukraine, who acted in a coordinated manner and according to a specific division of labor. And fourth, orders of superiors, as well as an apparent sense of impunity among perpetrators. Now, based on this body of evidence, we have concluded that the Russian authorities acted pursuant to a coordinated state policy of torturing Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. Therefore, in addition to torture as a war crime, they also committed torture as a crime against humanity. Our report also describes sexual violence, attacks on energy-related infrastructure, and attacks with explosive weapons that affected civilians and civilian objects.
Going back to the new common elements of torture, I will first talk about the transposition of violent practices from detention facilities in Russian Federation to similar facilities in Ukraine in areas under the control of Russian Federation. Former detainees consistently described the use of the same harsh practices in the same sequence, demonstrating the replication of practices of torture. Testimonies described a brutal so-called admission procedure, harsh practices designed to scare, break, humiliate, coerce, and punish detainees were used routinely. Personnel monitored compliance with their rules through surveillance cameras and imposed severe collective punishment for any breach. Interrogations were accompanied by some of the most violent treatment documented. Another disturbing element documented by the Commission is the recurrent use of sexual violence as a form of torture in detention facilities under the control of Russian authorities. Detainees were subjected to rape, attempted rape, attacks on genital organs through beatings, electric shocks, or burns, long periods of forced nudity, threats of sexual mutilation and castration, and intrusive, humiliating body searches. Former detainees reported beatings and electric shocks in the showers when they were naked and wet. The Commission's investigations found that the victims were both men and women, civilians and prisoners of war. However, the majority were men. Most prisoners of war reported having been subjected to sexual violence. Victims reported long-lasting psychological trauma as a consequence of these violations. I will now turn to another aspect. We found numerous situations in which medical care was denied in detention facilities, even where the Ukrainian detainee had visible serious injuries. Testimonies further disclose the involvement of medical personnel in committing negligent or abusive acts against detainees in the Russian Federation in breach of their ethical standards. We concluded that the Russian authorities thereby violated the international humanitarian law obligation to respect the health and integrity of detained civilians and provide medical attention to prisoners of war, as well as the detainees' human right to health.
Another important new element of which the Commission now has evidence are the organizational aspects that enable torture. In the well-established detention facilities, personnel of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation were in charge of the interrogations, which were held in the presence of the Federal Penitentiary Service regular personnel, as well as special purpose units, the so-called Spetsnaz. Multiple testimonies showed that these services had regular rotations and acted in coordination with one another and in accordance with the division of labor. The special purpose units of the penitentiary service were the main perpetrators of torture during the various phases of the detention. Moreover, the Commission now has evidence that the leadership of detention facilities or other higher-ranking Russian authorities ordered, encouraged, tolerated, or took no action to stop torture or ill treatment. I will now move to the Commission's investigation of new attacks with explosive weapons. They have targeted civilian targets, including hospitals and other medical facilities, cultural objects, and civilian sites such as a shopping center and markets at times of the day when many civilians were present. Some of these attacks were indiscriminate, in violation of international humanitarian law. We have also looked into attacks with explosive weapons in territory under Russian Federation control, but have not been able to complete investigations due to lack of access, despite many requests to the Russian Federation. Finally, the Commission has previously examined in detail large-scale waves of attacks on Ukraine's energy-related infrastructure since 10 October 22, and already concluded that those attacks were widespread and systematic. In the current mandate, we have investigated 9 additional waves of attacks between January 2023 and September 2024, and have assessed the impact of those attacks. The full impact on civilians is not yet known. In this report, we focus on the right to health and education of Ukrainians. The impact is particularly severe on certain categories of persons, including children and older persons, as well as persons with a disability or a medical condition. Primary carers of the former categories of persons, mostly women, were also seriously affected by the attacks. And the Commission will continue its investigations on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners, for those questions. Now we'll open the floor to your questions. If you could please identify yourself and the agency you work for. Edie from Associated Press.
Thank you on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. First, a quick question. Was your report presented to the Russian Federation, and did you receive any response? And you've certainly painted a pretty grim picture of what they've been doing. Have these violations been getting worse since the beginning of the war in February of 2022? Is, aside from basically the megaphone of telling us and doing reports and printing, presenting your findings to the Human Rights Council, is there anything else that you can do to try to either halt or mitigate these actions? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. It's normal procedure in such commissions of inquiry that the draft report is presented to all relevant parties affected by it. This also happened in our situation. We have always presented our drafts report both to the Ukrainian authorities and to the Russian authorities. The Russian authorities usually do not comment, they never comment upon our report. More generally, the Russian authorities have declined to grant us access to territories under their control, and I understand that they do not really recognize the Commission or wants to cooperate with it. Your second question related to whether it has got worse. That is a difficult question to answer. What we can, because we are of course investigating evidence as evidence comes to our knowledge. That evidence may be recent or not so recent. So it's rather the speed by which we discover or receive evidence that is what we focus on, and it makes it difficult. It is not so much to see whether it has been a gradual development. We cannot tell you that that is the case based on the evidence we have so far. And what can we do to alleviate the situation? This opens up a box. Let me first say that our work is, of course, the basis for possible judicial proceedings by other entities. We are not a court. We are a commission of inquiry, but we make known our views as to whether there are violations of human rights and breaches and crimes committed, but it will be for other entities to follow this up, and they may ask for evidence from us. And that is the purpose of the Commission. We serve as some kind of depository for evidence which may be useful in judicial proceedings. But there is also another aspect of what we can do, and that brings us more to non-judicial accountability.
Yes, so if I may, and first let me start by thanking you for your interest and you collectively. I think that it's very important for this to be known. The Commission has always defended what we call a broad notion of accountability that includes both judicial and non-judicial responses to the violations. After all, the right of victims beyond criminal accountability is well established. Victims have a right to reparation, they have a right to truth, and of course there is a general right to non-recurrence. And we have spoken about the non-judicial aspects of accountability in most of our reports. Just to illustrate, for example, the need for mental health and psychosocial support in the context of Ukraine, as in the context of many other post-conflict situations, is very acute. And we have spoken about this in previous reports. And if I may add a short point to what the chair said about trends, it is correct, of course, that we cannot speak about trends. But there is something important in this report about the gradual institutionalization of a whole apparatus of torture. We know that violations do not happen just out of chance. This degree of systematicity in violations requires the establishment of, for example, a division of labor between different services, the establishment not just of makeshift places of torture, but well-established sites. And that, of course, is a process that takes place over time. So I would like to emphasize that there is, in fact, a process of institutionalization that has accompanied the findings that we report now.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Elizondo from Al Jazeera English News Channel. Thanks a lot for your briefing. Just a couple questions, if I may. You mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I believe in your briefing in Geneva in September, if I'm not mistaken, but you might have mentioned it here as well, that there was coordinated use of torture by personnel from specific services of the Russian Federation. Which services?
Yes, so because I addressed this part in the briefing, so in the well-established detention centers that we have examined, and we have examined a variety, in total 41 different detention centers of different degrees of complexity and duration, from makeshift places to what we call well-established centers. In all of them, torture was a common practice. We didn't find any. And they include detention centers in 9 regions in Ukraine, in the occupied areas of Ukraine, and also 8 regions, 8 areas, we should say, to be precise, in the Russian Federation. All the interrogations and the detention centers are under the authority of the Federal Security Services of the Russian Federation. The main and of course, regular personnel of the Federal Penitentiary Service are in charge of the administration of the well-established detention centers. The main perpetrators of torture, in accordance with the testimony that we have received, are personnel from the Federal Security Services.
May I ask one follow-up? Thank you. Some member states have made claims over the last year that the orders for torture go all the way up to the Kremlin. In your investigation or your reporting, are you able to trace how high the orders come from in Russia for the orders to commit torture, or not?
We have not concluded on that point in our reports. It goes without saying that the totality of the evidence can show trends and point in directions, but there is no specific conclusion at this stage.
Okay, sorry. Evelyn, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you.
Please go ahead.
I came in late, so maybe you've covered this. Are they still abducting children and taking them into Russia? Yeah.
All right. We have, as you may recall, dealt with children in our previous reports. And we have listed examples of, for instance, abductions which were clearly in breach of international norms. In this report, we have not dealt with this issue. The reason being that we have focused on the 4 issues that we mentioned at the beginning of our conference, namely torture, sexual violence, explosive weapons, and attacks against energy-related infrastructure. So this does not mean that we are not continuing our investigations on the issue of children, but this is something to come in subsequent report, depending on our investigations.
One follow-up question. When Minister Lavrov had his press conference here, I asked him why they keep emphasizing Busha, do you pronounce it that way? When it was such a massacre, and he sort of cherry-picked to show that it was not. Do you cover that one this time too? Because it was quite shocking that he would mention that in his speech to the General Assembly.
So we are aware of this comment, and we have been asked whether we have a full list of victims, which is what Minister Lavrov was asking for. And our role, of course, is not to keep a full list of victims of any incident. But yes, we have investigated Bucha, and we have plenty of testimonies of people that witnessed family members and others being killed, and that corroborate some of the evidence and some of the reports that have been made public. So this was a subject of one of our previous reports, including some of the testimony that we received about what happened in Bucha. So.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to a question in the front row. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim, Al-Arabi Al-Jadid newspaper. I have 2 follow-ups. The first one, you talked about widespread torture. If you could elaborate on statistics and numbers as far as you can have this, because I'm aware of the fact that you don't have access. And the other question is about accountability. Where do you see possibilities of accountability for victims whether outside Russia, Ukraine, or Europe? Which roads do you see that should be taken? Thank you.
Starting with the issue of how widespread matters were, that is the novelty in this report. We have gradually investigated several provinces of Ukraine, but now we have gone through all that were under Russian occupation at some stage. And in all of them, we found, approximately 9, all of them, we found that there was torture against civilians and that prisoners of war also was subject to treatment. These provinces or in these areas, both in Ukraine and then also the other new element, namely the detention centers in Russia. Also there we have found, gone through quite a few of the detention centers in Russia, and there too we have found that in all of those that we have investigated, the practice is the same, similar. So that is the new issue with this report. When it comes to accountability, now accountability for victims, in a way, again, that's twofold. It's partly the judicial accountability and partly the non-judicial accountability. I will deal with the first aspect first. And first of all, as we know, the Prosecutor General and the prosecuting authority in Ukraine are constantly pursuing cases before the courts with the aim of obtaining convictions if people are guilty. And they have completed a large number of such trials within Ukraine. So that's the national authorities. In addition comes, of course, international authorities, and we are all in this room aware of the ICC initiatives, the wardens of arrest that have been tabled, and and the ICC is continuing its accountability work. There is, in principle, a third way, that is that other countries in possession of evidence can choose in their jurisdiction, if they have global jurisdiction covering at least what happened in Ukraine, can institute criminal proceedings. So that these are the three roads in a way. And in addition, there is a plan to establish other tribunals, one concerning aggression, but that's not a completed exercise. So that is for the judicial accountability.
Yeah, and as for the non-judicial parts of accountability, I guess that the most noteworthy bit of progress that can be mentioned is the adoption by the General Assembly of the resolution on the Register of Damages, the subsequent Council of Europe resolution doing the same, and in fact the establishment of the register now, which is open to the filing of claims by Ukrainian victims. So a process has been started on the reparations front. On the question of other forms of assistance to victims, there is a great deal of interest on the part of many different groups, both national and international groups, on the provision of mental health and psychosocial support. I think that the international community, including the UN, can do a bit more to try to coordinate and to support those efforts, since it is so well established scientifically that the earlier that you provide support, the more you spare victims what could be potential years and years of trauma, And it is also very well established that trauma travels intergenerationally, and that is something that we need to avoid. So greater attention to this topic would not be undue, but again, it has started, and the Ukrainian government, of course, is aware of it. I think that a bit more attention to this on the part of the international community would be very useful.
And I would like to supplement my answer since you asked for statistics. Well, statistic is a big word, but we have some numbers. And let me provide you with some specific numbers, and you will find that in the annex of our report. And you will see that in the areas under Russian Federation control in Ukraine, we have mentioned 9 provinces where torture took place. And we have investigated the situation in 21 facilities in those 9 provinces. And turning now to the other aspects, namely prisoners of war in the Russian Federation, or civilians in the Russian Federation, we have 8 areas in that country, and there are 9 facilities. And the striking is that in all these facilities, we have these similarities, which we have already explained.
Do you have approximate numbers about how many people we are talking about in these?
It's a considerable number, but we don't have a list counting. But it's a considerable number because, after all, the topic is widespread and systematic, and that requires a considerable portion of evidence. So, and we have had these investigations going for a couple of years now. Almost, we are getting closer to the third, also after 3 years, and gradually we have formed this body of evidence.
Okay, any other questions from the room or online? I don't see any online. Okay. All right, well, we'll wrap this up. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good day.